Greetings, everyone. My name is Mkhululi Ncube. I'm the Programs Officer at the African Minerals Development Center, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being the moderator for this particular webcast. So what we're going to be talking about is speaking on the decarbonizing of mining value chains on the continent done through circularity. Of course, as the global demand for minerals and metals continues to increase, considering the way that things are going at the moment, it now becomes a bit more succinct or poignant that we ensure that our mining value chains from the get-go are something that are also decarbonized. And so whether it's going to be through renewable energy or whether it's going to be through a whole new circular economy scenario, the idea is, as much as circularity is going to be part of it can no longer be taken away from us that circularity is part of how we are going to be moving forward in decarbonizing our value chains throughout the value chain, from mining until mine closure. And as such, this is where we are going to get perspectives from experts that are within this scenario. And I'll be speaking to them. And the first of the experts I'll be introducing at the moment will be Mr. Frank Dixon Mujenyi. Is Frank going to come in?
Yes, I'm here. Nice to be here. My name is Frank Dixon Mujenyi. I'm the Director for Minerals Development Institution.
Right. Thank you for joining us, Frank. Next will be Shirley Weber. I think she can give an introduction of who she is, a brief introduction of who she is. Shirley, are you in?
Thank you, Muku. Nice being on this very important call for Africa. Shirley Weber, as you've mentioned, I look after resources and energy for one of the financial institutions on the African continent, and namely ABSA. Looking forward to the discussion.
Right. And then finally, we have Suzanne. Are you there, Suzanne?
I'm here. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Suzanne. I'm actually co-founder and director of the African Circular Economy Network. I hope to bring a very proactive discussion element today to the table, talking about more of a preventative approach to decarbonization. Yeah.
I love it when you, as a person who actually is an expert in this, also stammers a bit, because it makes my life a bit easier, because it means we are all human at the end of the day. I was afraid that my stammering is going to make me feel like I am the one who's dropping the ball. Well, thank you to the panel. Welcome, Frank. Welcome, Shirley. Welcome, Suzanne. Now, if we're to get straight into it, we should realize, I mean, in terms of context setting, circularity is something that we are hoping will not only minimize waste, but will aim to reduce the anything that is not resource efficient, whether it's going to be the mining itself or the mineral resource that's been mined, and those that are within, or should we say the tailings, or that are within the mining process or product. And so as such, I will get straight into it to make sure that we do have space for our participants at the end of the day. I will ask a question to everybody. And here we're saying, could each of you, we'll start with Frank, of course, briefly share your perspective on what is the most significant as a challenge to Africa's mining industry, especially on the journey towards decarbonization. Frank, I will start with you. You can take it.
Thank you so much, Mkhululi. And I hope I'm quite visible enough. If I am, everybody can say yes. If not, I can remove my video so that I can have more network. Thank you for that question. The decarbonization of the Africa's minerals or mining value chain, the importance of it through security and or not. I'll just speak from the standpoint of the Africa Mining Vision, and I'll bring in one of the instruments of the Africa Mining Vision, more specifically the African Minerals and Energy Resource Classification, which calls on two issues, on two critical factors. One is the comprehensive resource recovery, and the other one is the zero waste as one of success factors or critical factors. So the decarbonization of this mining sector through circularity would look at how do we ensure that we have exhausted our minerals to look for other minerals.
Frank, I'm sorry. Is it just me or you are breaking a bit?
When we have
Oh no.
Breaking up.
Some of what would be called tailings and so forth. Reduce that kind of more mining by ensuring that it comprehensively recover some of the minerals that would be left behind. One example to give is let me hear from others.
All right.
Hello?
So yes. So we can hear part of what you will have said, but then other parts were actually eaten up by the loss of your bandwidth signal. But it is fine. It is fine. I think I did. Can we switch off your camera, Frank? Maybe that will help, because it definitely seems to be a bandwidth issue. So we could attempt to switch off your camera and see if that will be better.
Let's try that. Like I said,
exactly. Right. But in the meantime, we'll still take the same question, and it will go to Suzanne, just for the purposes of repeat. Would you be able to briefly share your perspective on what is most significant as challenges, right, in Africa's mining industry towards decarbonization?
Yeah. Look, the decarbonization as part of the energy transition is a huge thing, because it obviously accelerates the need to secure the supply of minerals and metal resources. So that becomes now a priority. But we anticipate obviously a shortfall in the availability of primary materials, which will create a huge pressure relative to the demand, and it will cause price volatility and exacerbate probably also the resource curse of some of the African countries. That's why it's important that we make a shift towards the circular economy, and where the mining industry should really do nothing less than rethink their entire core business model in terms of how can we make sure that we actually ease that pressure on the demand by perhaps becoming a bit more innovative in terms of how we're providing in future our services. And I say services and not products, because that's what materials as services will be all about. So for me, this is really the pressure comes from not only that the mining industry itself has to learn to decarbonize in its operation, but also because of the people decarbonizing that the mining industry serves. You know, that is a huge pressure that the mining industry is under now.
I think we'll come back definitely to the innovative term of services, because that's for those who are in the, well, I've been in the software industry before, where software as a service, when initiated, people were looking at it as it was a visionary thing, but it is now very standard. Now straight to you, Shirley. Same question, or would you want me to repeat it? Vis-a-vis what you see as the most significant challenges that the continent's mining industry has when it comes to the journey towards decarbonization.
No, thanks, Muko. I think it's actually a very important question, because Africa's got 54 countries in it, and each of us have our own issues with regards, for example, to access to power. I think that's very important, and not just access to power, but reliable power, and obviously, more focusing on sustainability, to renewable side. And as we've seen with countries, and I'm going to give a few examples, countries like Kenya is very reliant on hydro for power. Clearly, if you look at countries like Egypt, we're sitting with sun, etc. And if you look at South Africa specifically, we have an abundance, to the traditional coal, as well as then building up our renewables portfolios as well. So I think that access to power is one aspect, but one thing very close to the power issue is really the infrastructure that goes with it. In other words, transmission, distribution. Is there enough grid capacity in order for the power to be available, to those specific industries that need it? So that's another aspect that I think we should focus on. And I think some of the other challenges is that, like Suzanne said, we do sit with a lot of newer energy minerals and metals. We sit with rare earths on the continent, we sit with lithium, we sit with graphite, everything that's used, in the greener energy and what's needed for transition. One aspect I think we can do better as a continent is the processing and the beneficiation of it within our countries, which will help, that there's not a waste of, for example, all the ore going out and then ore coming back in a different form, because we need it for another type of industry. So those are just a few things that I thought is important to mention with regards to the challenges in this whole mining and decarbonization aspects.
Right. It's great that you've mentioned the regionalization of infrastructure and power access. I will come back to you on that one. But for now, let me come back to you, Frank. So Frank, you spoke to comprehensive resource recovery. First of all, the African Minerals Energy and Resource Classification Framework, AMREC-PAC. And rightfully so, you speak to the comprehensive recovery, resource recovery aspect of what is referred to within AMREC. What I did get from you, even though you were breaking up, was the issue of referring to tailings. I want to stick to the issue of tailings. Comprehensive resource recovery on tailings, right? Can we say the value chains of dealing with tailings can be considered whole new value chains, or they will just be part of the whole mining value chain? Because remember, tailings at some point, mining companies actually look at them as dumps, right? And so do you think we can effectively integrate those dumps, if I'm to refer to them technically as dumps, into circularity within whole new value chains, or should they be considered as now part of the value chain, the mining value chain, considering circularity?
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you much better, yes.
Yeah, I've visited a number of sites. I was going to give you an example of our copper mining, which took place in 60s and 70s. And where now the mining of copper was left and people exported copper. At that time, Uganda was benefiting from, the GDP was benefiting up to 30% from copper, but the cobalt was not required then. Now, we had a new process which came in now to process the old tailings and remove cobalt, which is required now. I've just come back from one of the mining areas of Wolfram, where we have mountains which have already overgrown with the bush, but they are original tailings of Wolfram. So people are now thinking we can actually, instead of now starting to dig new new holes and so forth, could we now recycle, go back and refine what has been already left behind and see what we can get? But then now that raises the question whether it is going to be part of the origin of the existing value chain, as part of what AMREC is proposing, that now if you are going into a new mining, you need to consider comprehensive resource recovery, and then move on to do other minerals and make sure that, because at the end of the day, if you are going to do rehabilitation of that area, you want to ensure that there is no mineral left behind to go back and mine again. But now, what we need to now understand is what those tailings that I've said already, which are making mountains and hills, how do we handle those? Are we going to consider them as new mining value chains, or are we going to put them into the as part of the new mining chains, or can we see how best we can do them, because they can't stand on alone because they have not enough minerals there to make economic viability. So we need to see how then we can consider them as recycling. But I also wanted to look at a part of, like in the steel industry, for instance. I know maybe steel is not that of the critical minerals, but when you look at a lot of steel scrap left behind in Africa, in the mining areas, those were mined before. There are a lot of equipment and scraps and stuff that was left behind, which the new mining companies cannot use. I know there is a lot of people buying them and doing that, but how best can we ensure that with the new technologies, we don't leave this behind, so that they will require recycling them in future, so that we make sure that, again, we have zero waste at the end of the day.
Okay, all right. I got what you were saying, and I'm definitely with you there, especially when it comes to the tailings / the dumps. But I think it then introduces a very interesting aspect, which maybe hopefully when we have enough time, even Shirley will be able to respond to. Because the valuation of a mine, right, runs until end of the resource that is spoken to. But now we see tailings are actually a whole new business model that can be referred to. So how, I mean, it's now going to be interesting how AMREC is actually going to address this, and I think it actually does have aspects of addressing it. But we are hoping that Shirley and her cohorts in the industry are looking forward to ensuring that they have those very innovative systems of ensuring that when you value a particular project, you are actually valuing what you know are going to be tailings. Because remember, the tailings at times, it's not that they didn't know what was in there. It's just that it was not valued at the time that they knew it was going to be a dump. But before I get to Shirley, I'll get to you, Suzanne. You spoke to materials as a service. And like I said, I used to be, at the time, back in the day, an individual who was very keen on dealing with software as a service. I remember I was a very young man when I was a programmer. And when we spoke on issues of software as a service, very few people took us seriously. So on the continent, we were laughed at until Microsoft and Amazon and Google took it on, and is now a global norm. So materials as a service is an issue of carbonizing on the continent via circularity. Please speak more to it, and in your perspective, let us know how we can actually be prepared, and we are not laughed at, but we are actually pioneers in terms of ensuring that we take advantage of a decarbonizing mining value chain on the continent with materials as a service. Please, sorry, you can go on.
Before we go there, I'd like to just make another notion about tailings. I mean, have you ever thought about if you change your core business and you look at e-waste as a kind of a tailing where you have a lot of concentrated minerals and materials. So for me, this is a mystery. I work a lot also in the field of electronic waste. For me, it's a mystery why the mining industry is not latching on to redeveloping its core business or expanding its core business much more into the end processing of e-waste. Because the reality that we see in Africa is that we receive, well, we mine the resources, the primary resources, they get assembled somewhere in China, Europe is benefiting from them, they come back as e-waste, right? We dismantle the stuff, all the juicy stuff, all the good stuff goes back because we don't have any end processing facilities in Africa. So can I please add to the debate of tailings, not just the physical tailings of the mines, but actually the tailings that I would call e-waste, that we not only, that we also develop actually end processing facilities regionally. I think that would need to happen regionally in Africa, end processing facilities, so that we can actually retain our own mineral wealth in Africa that is in this electronic waste. So that's just the one thought on the tailings. Now, the materials as a service, it sounds a little bit spaced out, but it's actually a brilliant concept, and it has been explored on a couple of conferences. We're looking now to try to find a pilot project, because what it basically is the transfer of the right to use a material, which is called usufruct, rather than transferring the ownership. Now, why on earth would you want to do this? What is the advantage of this? Well, it's very simple. If you think about it, Europe is now trying to fulfill its energy transition ambitions, needs lots of resources from Africa. Now, if we go on with the traditional model of just handing over the resources and selling them, okay, what's going to happen to Africa when we are ready for our own energy transitions? There will be no resources left, right? So materials as a service really puts the emphasis on say we retain our wealth in the country. The MAST means there is local ownership of mined materials, but we have the right to monetize the use along the value chain. So all along the value chain, basically this usufruct principle takes place, that every material component or product along the value chain will be sold as in a service model. That's really what materials as a service is. So you would, for example, have a certain contingent, and you know, we have now the digital passports. That's now a really exciting development. We're going to see in 2027 the introduction of a digital passport for batteries in Europe, which will tell you exactly, you know, how efficient they are in terms of, you know, are they having potential to be reused? But there's so much more that you can put into a digital passport. So in principle, we could link something up like a South African or African mine mining a certain contingent in kilograms of gold or copper, sending it to Europe, but instead of selling it, having a leasing contract, a usufruct kind of principle. And the benefit would be that there could be a rent generated through that leasing, that gold can flow back to the communities. So what I would foresee is that it could greatly benefit to uplift mining communities, to provide funds for proper mining closures and things like that. And also it would basically build up substantial resource stocks for mines, just above ground, not underground. It would be above ground, but it would obviously completely put the concept, the core business of mines on its head. But it would have a lot of advantages, because it could extend the life of mines that currently are entirely dependent on extracting, you know, raw non-renewable materials out of the ground, by saying they can retain that wealth and building up those resource stocks. So that's why we're discussing it.
And you brought about, as you were speaking, I got to think of something. When you speak of materials as a service, it becomes very interesting to think of the fact that you do know there are, I mean, we all know this, there are countries that have a tendency of stockpiling material. So basically, when they stockpile material, they then become warehouses, and they start paying rent for warehousing materials that they are stockpiling. It's going to introduce a whole lot of interesting financial models. I can see how Shirley will have sleepless nights on dealing with some of this.
But you know, just think about it. If you know that you're leasing a material, what does it do to your intention to design products differently? You know, obviously, that you don't own those materials, which means you will develop and design equipment that you can recover those materials easily. So it would create a whole revolution along the value chain that circular economy-based design is taking really serious.
Exactly. That's good. And so we then dish to, for me, I always think about the money, because when it comes to mining, it's always show me where the money is and where it's going. So Shirley, are there any examples, or should we say partnership projects, demonstrate to your earlier point, how access to power and regionalization of infrastructure is something that we can deal with? And how are you handling it? Do you actually have functional ways of showing that these newer energy minerals can be dealt with through power pooling or regional pooling? From a financial perspective, does it make your lives easier? Does it make it difficult? Do you have projects that demonstrate that it's easy or it's difficult? Please, by all means.
Yeah, no, thanks, Muku. It feels like I must answer to Frank and Suzanne as well. But anyway, maybe just quickly on the tailings, especially in South Africa, where the gold industry, for example, has been here forever. We've seen many of the tailing dams, etc., disappearing, the dumps that you mentioned. And the reason why that is happening, when the gold rush started, there wasn't the technology to actually recover, the grams that we would currently get out of underground, for example. So what we've seen in many instances in Africa, some of the mines becomes marginal. And if they can include the tailings recovery from a grams per ton point of view, it's actually quite good, because in many instances, there's more gold per ton in the dumps than, underground if it becomes, end of life mine, for example. So I just wanted to mention that. So it's vital that I think those tailings become, and it can be part of an existing operation, or in many instances, tailings are being sold as a separate, as a separate asset. So we've seen that as well. And the way we're financing those are very different, if it's part of a bigger mining entity or if it's part of a tailings one. Just with regards to maybe the ownership versus leasing that Suzanne has mentioned, and I have to say something because I'm a financial institution, we would like to know exactly what you've said. Where's the asset and in which hands it is, etc. And we've seen it specifically, and I know we're not talking about diamonds specifically, but the movement of diamonds, for example, or the movements of gold is so important, and the tracking of it, and even if it becomes, done via a proper tracking system, then it's absolutely feasible. But ultimately, banks still want to know where's the asset. And if we've taken, for example, a project finance transaction, we would like to know that it will be repaid by the selling, of the ore, etc., the loan amount. So I just wanted to mention that. So with regards to decarbonization and what we see the mines are doing in South Africa as well as in the rest of Africa, is if it's energy intensive minerals that we are sitting with, for example, it is very important that mines put up either before or after the meter, depending on grid capacity and if there are other users in the vicinity, to put up either sun or wind, depending on weather conditions, those renewable plants next to their mining operations. So what would happen is that the intensity of carbon linked to that specific asset will obviously be less than if we look at it compared to if you had fossil fuels being used to get the ore out of the ground. So it becomes a bit more a greener metal, for example, to take any type of commodity out. And we've done many of those renewable plant financings for many mining operations for energy intensive users, and Frank, you've mentioned, for example, the steel industry, where we know a lot of power is being consumed. Putting up renewables is vital in that specific regard as well. examples on where we are working in the rest of Africa is looking at those energy, minerals and metals that is used in the renewables process. So if I am financing wind, for example, where we know there's wind turbines, etc., how can I not look at rare earths who help moves the magnets, the wind turbines? And the same goes with, if we want everyone to have electric vehicles, then power access is obviously important. But why can I not start helping financing, you know, things like lithium or graphite that goes into the process that helps the EV market, for example? And that is a very difficult question for financial institutions as well. Why? Because this is not platinum or gold or copper that can easily be hedged and you can peg the price, etc. These are not known, you know, where the price would go, etc. So to get to market dynamics and understanding that is crucial for those. And because we're sitting on the African continent, we want to understand it. So that's why we've done a lot of work as ABSA to understand these markets to get to that point. So just a few examples of what we are trying to do to decarbonize and help mines decarbonize their overall energy usage.
All right. So you touched on a lot of things I'd want to follow up on, but there's one that I brought up earlier, and you did touch on it. The issue of who owns the asset when we speak of materials as a service, especially if that asset is going to be gotten on the continent through a decarbonized process, and then it's going to sit. It comes back to my question I was mentioning of stockpiling, and it goes to sit elsewhere, right? Before it's actually used. Is the leasing that is being done by, or the payment of the lease that is being done by the stockpiler going to be part of the amortization of whatever has been given by the bank out here? And how do you recover that? It's, like I said, I foresee nightmares for you, but they are good nightmares, because at the end of the day, we then become pioneers.
You would just introduce a different element, and that would be the element of commons. Okay, and commons would mean that this is not just that you look through a lens of a resource, but also of a community and their norms and their values of the community where the resource comes from. And this is perhaps not a traditional concept for the mining sector to think about commons, but I think it is something that we should really keep in mind to reconsider in the mining industry, to understand that. And there is things like, for example, the Alaska Fund. It's not something that's like completely up in my head here, okay? There are schemes globally that work on commons. Like, for example, there's the Alaska Fund. That is also a fund. It needs to be obviously well governed. Ideally, it should be blockchain so that no corrupt politician can destroy it or something, but a blockchain kind of secured trust fund, okay? And they have this, for example, in Alaska. Alaska is a country where also a lot of resources are taken out, and anyone who is an Alaskian gets actually every year a dividend, a payout, you know, for saying, you know, this is your contribution because this is part of our contribution to the commons.
Right. And the joy of all this, I know, Frank, we seem like we are speaking over you, is it actually very much aligns to the issue of the way I understand the issue of comprehensive resource recovery as per AMREC. The benefit for the continent is going to be massive should the industry be flipped upside down and we think of commons instead of just the asset. But I genuinely feel sorry for Shirley for sleepless nights that she will encounter with this. But now, I think for now, we've actually even addressed the issue of the recovery of these minerals and where they would be sitting. But now we get into questions from the audience. There's one particular question that links to all this that, of course, is not necessarily even initiated by us. It's a question of how the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism for African mines will push for local beneficiation. Is it something that will ensure that local beneficiation happens? Because I'm pretty sure the thresholds for the carbon content that is within the minerals going to Europe may initially be too high for any profitability to come from Africa's mines. Are we seeing this as a punch, as someone would say, a punch in the face that actually helps us? I would start with Frank as a responder to this. I would push you, Frank, to answer this first. Frank, I think you're muted. Is this me?
No, it's Frank. Okay.
Oh, shame. But fortunately, I was just going to start with Frank, and then I was going to come to Suzanne, hoping that Frank would have touched on, and the answer that I was hoping Frank would touch on, or what you'd include in his answer, would be the issue of, yes, it seems like a punch in the face initially, but it actually pushes us to start adding value and processing these minerals on the continent for continental usage. It's just going to be interesting, though, and this is where I was going to come to Suzanne, that copper mined in Zambia, when it's difficult to export to, let's say, for instance, where it wants to be used in the EU territory, then has to possibly have a market on the continent, right? And it's a materials as a service entity that we are now implementing. Do you foresee the materials as a service entity then also from a different but very innovative lens, pushing such things as the accelerated adoption of the African Continental Free Trade Area? Because that leasing as commons then puts the continent as a common, right? It puts the continent as a common rather than a community, or it takes the country as, because the country will now have a common external tariff, right? So Africa really becomes one.
I've just come out of a meeting. I sit at a presidential investors. No, I'm not.
Frank, are you back?
Maybe I remove my.
Is this me?
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you, Frank.
Can
Yes,
you hear
we
me?
can hear you. Yes. Yes, Frank. That's a shame. But whilst he's coming back, Suzanne, had you gotten that, or should I restructure the question?
I got it. I think, you know, the trick would be to really embed it in, as you say, in Africa-wide kind of interest areas, like the African Green Mineral Strategy, for example, you know, which was developed. And that was on that level where I actually had a little chat with the African Development Bank. And they were actually quite open to listen to it, or to at least learn about it, you know, because if this is considered as a key driver, and if it's acknowledged as a circular economy intervention, you know, that goes beyond just trying to find circular innovation in an otherwise remaining linear business model system, you know, that would be the real game changer. I really think it would. So yeah, I think the challenge would be that it becomes really mainstream in strategies. I mean, if someone like the African Union could take a look at that and say, all right, the European Union wants now all our resources, and we give them all our resources for the energy transition, but we actually demand from the EU that, you know, that the energy transition is connected to a major pilot project with Africa, that whatever materials are used for, you know, fulfilling the energy transition in Europe will actually be ring-fenced with something like a leasing system, even if it's a pilot. I'm not, look, I spoke to some guys from the ICCM, and they said, look, Suzanne, things will not change overnight, but they are quite happy to say, why not 10% of our core business, just to test out the dynamics? And I think that's all we want right now. We don't have all the answers, okay? So people can now ask me very complicated questions. I probably don't have the answer. But, you know, sometimes you just have to take the plunge and say, okay, from a risk management perspective, what can we afford? We're standing with the back on the wall. You know, our platinum mining belt will be mined in about 15 years. We're already spending a lot of money trying to continue to think what to do with all our mining communities. That will be a huge cost. What is there to lose to perhaps try to create a system that can create rental incomes that can also help us, you know, to do something positive and re-skill those mining communities, because that is something that I know the likes of South African Lonmin Platinum and whatever, they are actually faced with that right now.
All right, that's good. I'm glad you said you spoke to our sister organization, the ADB. I call them the sister organization. Yes, Frank, are you back? I hope you're back. Are you muted? You're muted, Frank. You are muted. Oh no.
Muku, maybe why we're trying to get Frank back online, maybe I can just add to your question on, for example, the carbon, you know, the border adjustment mechanism, you know, what we think is going to happen. So if I look at your example of copper, and copper sits in Zambia, copper sits in the DRC, and there's very big resources, you know, that's obviously starting in new mining operations, as well as a bit in Botswana, for example, on the copper side. We've seen that many of those commodities actually bypass Europe, for example. So there are other jurisdictions where this is going to, and we've actually seen a lot of partial ownership of many of the other countries coming in. So I think that is also important to note that although it's forcing us as a continent to make sure that our energy usage is different in order to reduce the carbon intensity of what metal we produce, that means we can't just think of one jurisdiction to go to. There must be more than one. So, and with regards to, maybe Suzanne, it links in a little bit with your question on or comment that we should do regionalization, but we don't necessarily have to do everything initially, you know, up to the end of the product, but at least starting with, you know, like middle processing in a value chain, and then it can go out. But we need to start somewhere, for example, and copper is a good example where we know you can either do the concentrate or the cathode or whatever you want to choose as a country. But in many instances, putting regulations in place in a country to say you can't export, but there's no processing happening within the country because there's no capacity or plants, that is also something that needs to be worked on, you know, from country's point of view. I just wanted to add that.
Yes, exactly. And entirely from the green mineral strategy, that's actually the whole idea. Not everyone should aim to do the same thing, right? Have parts of the value chain that you focus on, and it's easier to decarbonize if you know the part of the value chain that you're focusing on. You innovate based on the part of the value chain you're part of, or the part of the value chain that you are concentrating on. And so the whole value chain at the end of the day, if it is entirely on the continent, it eventually lowers the carbon content or the carbon footprint of whichever mineral we are mining, ensuring that we have regionalized the processes on the continent. Now, Frank, I will try to get a hold of you one more time because we're running out of time. Are you able to speak now? I hope you are. Frank, can you hear us? I think Frank is, because we can see you, but I don't think you can hear us. I think there's a lag. I think the lag with Frank is a bit more than usual. In the meantime, I think that will let us leave the more questions that are coming from the forum, or should we say from the audience, and then we will then stick to, or should we say we'll come out with our closing remarks, as it were. I never thought I would actually say this because it didn't seem like it's actually 40 minutes gone. So we'll get to start our closing remarks. I'll start with you, Suzanne. Hopefully I'll end with Frank. Hopefully by the time we are done, you will be able to give your closing remarks. It's unfortunate that we've had this technical glitch. So Suzanne, any outro that you could give as a crucial takeaway to this webinar and the audience?
Dare to disrupt the system, because if we trying to improve a system that we know is linear and from the outset problematic, it's just becoming less bad, but we're not really having a true breakthrough that can really change the game. And it doesn't take much. I just very quickly tell you, I was in Switzerland and I spoke to another consultant who's very well connected with gold refiners there. She said, Suzanne, we should try to get a pilot project. There are watchmakers in Switzerland. There is a demand for fair traded gold. And those watchmakers are quite happy to go beyond the traditional idea of what fair traded gold looks like. They would be probably quite interested, and see it as a selling point to get gold materials as a service, be part of a leasing scheme. Sure, it might not be a large scale, but all I want is a pilot where we can study the dynamics, how it flows in the value chain, because obviously it can only work if everyone is a winner in the value chain. Otherwise there's a problem, and to find out and to figure out those little flaws in a very tightly controlled value chain that perhaps just leads to one producer with a few gold refiners, with one boutique mine somewhere in Africa, and just study everything in between. That would be my wish, that we can see this in my living days.
Right, and then Shirley, you want to quickly finish off before I do my monologue for closing?
Yes, no, thanks. I'll be quick. I just think Africa sits with an abundant resources, and it goes from renewables, the sun, the wind, up to energy, minerals and metals, and the usual precious metals as well. I think we should use that. We should use it as part of a value chain, and ultimately we should realize capital in future will follow sustainability. And how do we do that? By looking at aspects like we've done today to ensure that investors do come through to Africa. Thank you.
Lovely. And hopefully at next year's Africa Green Economy Summit that will take place between 19 and 20 February in Cape Town, everyone will have registered. There will be a link that will be circulated. That is the wearevuka.com/green economy. That is something that we'll continue this conversation on. And then, of course, for the daily insights, we have the seafrica.com website. And then, of course, to stay subscribed and informed, we are dealing with still the registration on seafrica.com. And then we are hoping that as we watch the Mining Review Africa, for those of us who actually read it, we ensure that we follow through all the way until the Africa Green Economy Summit next year. I am sorry that we could not have Frank give his final remarks. I'll attempt one more time, but I don't see us being able to do it. Frank, can you hear us? And we cannot hear you. That's a shame. Oh well. Okay, so we'll try to see how to deal with this later. Hopefully Frank will have another session like this. And to the audience, thank you for being a great audience. We're hoping to entertain you again in a few, whether it's weeks or months, but thank you for having joined us today. My name is Mkhululi Ncube. I have been your moderator for today. Thank you, Shirley Weber. Thank you, Suzanne Kacha, and thank you, Frank. Have a good day.